The following podcast was produced in-house for KQEK.com. The title of Tom Roston's book, I Lost It at the Video Store, A Filmmaker's Oral History of a Vanished Era, seems to imply the local video store is no longer extant. But as you'll hear in our conversation, the rental shop survives as indie outlets in urban centers like Toronto and Los Angeles, and as the modest chain Family Video, scattered in less urban locales throughout the United States. I've said before in prior blogs that Toronto is unique, perhaps freakishly so, for being blessed with about 8 to 9 video shops that collectively rent and sell chunks of film history, which aren't easily found on Amazon, Netflix, or via other online vendors. I'll have further words after our conversation, so let's move on to Tom Roston and listen to his views on the strange case of the vanishing video store.
I really enjoy the book, and I wonder if you've been surprised and pleased by its reception, because it comes at a time when video stores are rare. They've been written off as dinosaurs by some, and sometimes fiercely defended by others, if not whole communities. And perhaps the most extreme case of a store being sort of saved would be if a store becomes a non-profit cultural archive.
Yeah, I've found the reaction to be incredibly heartening. It's been very strong, and there's so much love out there for the video store. Largely, what I've been surprised by was that it's kind of cross-generational. I'm Generation X, and I think people who are born between around 1960 and 1980, which is a pretty wide range, are the ones who this book is most for, because they're the ones who really grew up during the video store era. But there's also this interesting retro thing going on. The same kids who love vinyl now are also digging video stores. And so I've had a lot of young people in their 20s or younger coming to the events and to the signings, and it's been really exciting to see. I mean, it's clearly a dying era, and not that the stores are all dead, but the era as a dominant form is dying, and I think that makes people, hold on tighter. And so the passion and love is really there.
One of the things that seems to be kind of an odd irony, I guess, is Toronto is kind of unique in having about 8 or 9 video stores that are still there, but they're all packed into the West End. I don't think there's really anything left in the East End, and I'd really be surprised if there's anything even in the northern parts of the suburbs. And it just seems to be a bit ironic that the suburbs, which I guess were responsible for the huge success of home video and video rental stores, they've been essentially abandoned by video stores, or they've abandoned the video stores themselves. And now the only place it seems where you can actually get video stores is in the downtown cores or inner cities.
It brings up a really interesting issue, because I have been very surprised at the stores that have survived on a sort of geographical level. Because actually, I would disagree with that in terms of the U.S. There's a chain called Family Video, and they have literally like 650 outlets. So, it's kind of shocking for people to hear. It's shocking for me to realize that there is a chain that is doing really well. I mean, it's very suburban, it's very middle American. It's something that you never see anywhere near a big city, but somewhere between Chicago and, Spokane, Washington, there are a lot of stores that are catering to families. And the way they found a way to survive is that they cater to, I guess, people who have family values, for lack of a better phrase, and who want pizza. They sell pizza in their stores. So there's that phenomenon. And then also, I mean, I'm ashamed to say that as a New Yorker, New York City really does not have many stores left. There are just a few left, and they're not stupendous. The Los Angeles area has a few, and I agree. I think Toronto is one of the stalwarts, really, in terms of video store culture that remains.
One of the feeds that I get is from a New York City-based publicist, and he frequently post details of how the locations within New York City, especially the neighborhoods, they're radically changing and they're becoming more commercialized and clearly geared towards an upscale market. And you mentioned at the beginning and end of your book Kim's Video, and there were a couple of feeds I remember that he included in that as well, where Kim's was pretty much an institution. And it's just how that at one point was the mainstay. You had a lot of these independent stores, and now within New York City, I guess there's just a handful of stores.
Yeah, it's just a handful. The Video Free Brooklyn, it's small, but it's very well curated. But there's no question, Kim's was the store, and the guy who ran it, Mr. Kim, he couldn't make money doing it, so it went under. And it's sad to see. In terms of there being a public space for people to talk about film, it's just not that strong anymore. And you're seeing it changing the way cities are formulated in terms of their cultural spaces are formulated.
Well, Kim's and I guess Scarecrow Video perhaps are the most prominent in terms of a store that had a huge archive of films, and they would still retain videotapes. I don't know if they even had laser discs, but there's been a number of observations where it seems as though a lot of film history that only existed on these dead formats have just sort of vanished, and it's only collectors that have it. And there's, I guess, kind of an unofficial preservation urge among collectors to retain these, because what you find the studios are releasing, what they're licensing to third parties, and certainly what's available on Netflix is just a fraction of what once existed broadly on tape. And it's sort of the opinion where if it's not on Netflix, I guess the average consumer thinks, well, it never existed on video, and maybe because it never existed or it's not on Netflix, that it's just not worth my time.
Yeah, definitely. One of the, tragedies, if we can call it that, is that as new technologies develop, more films disappear. So when we went from the development of the VHS tape, only a certain number of films were transferred to VHS. And then only certain films are transferred to DVD, and now only certain films are being transferred to streaming. So with each new wave, more films are getting lost. It has become the responsibility of individuals, like you said, to unofficially, hold on to these collections, and especially, stores like you mentioned, Scarecrow. But there's also Facets in Chicago, and there's a great store in Pasadena, in northern LA, called Videotech. There still are stores in the U.S. and Canada that are doing it. And I have to say, there's also an official entity, Yale. Did you hear that Yale has salvaged a whole collection of, I think it was like 70s or 80s horror on VHS tape?
I think I read that, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're doing it really because of it's the physical, tactile art form. They don't really even care about the content of what's on those tapes. They're just trying to preserve those tapes, the actual physical tapes.
Well, it's kind of the complete polar opposite of what happened locally here about 2 years ago, where I think someone with well intentions essentially made up a post saying, we will recycle videotapes, we will essentially get rid of it in a very green manner, so that way we get rid of all this clutter that's been in your basement. And he got some very angry replies from people saying, well, wait a second, you're essentially telling people, get rid of all your movies, get rid of all these things that they don't know that actually have some cultural value, certainly within film. And you can't just simply arbitrarily grab all of these tapes and junk them all and potentially get rid of a chunk of history, certainly within, a local, if not a provincial, or perhaps just a national level. So you need to look at what people are giving to you, because there may be something in there that has some important value, and you need to preserve that. And he kind of stepped back a little bit afterwards, because I think he was surprised by the reaction, where people were saying, well, hold on, you've got to go about it in a very meticulous fashion.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that there are, thousands, tens of thousands, probably not, maybe we can say hundreds of thousands of individuals in North America who really value these tapes. And I think an example of that is Vulcan Video in Austin, Texas. They were on Jimmy Kimmel. Did you see that Jimmy Kimmel video store video?
I saw a bit of it, yeah.
Yeah, so it was this funny thing where Jimmy Kimmel and Matthew McConaughey did this retro ad for a video store. And what happened was with Vulcan Video, they started getting these tapes sent to them by people all across the country who say, we don't have a VHS player anymore, but please take our tapes because we want you to have them. And, people were literally spending more money on the packaging to send it to Vulcan Video than, the video tapes themselves were worth. But that's how much people care about them.
The adult industry has always sort of been at the forefront of any new technology, any new format that comes along. They figure, well, how can we essentially exploit it and then inundate consumers with our product, so that way it's a viable format. And I wonder if from the research that you've done and the interviews that you've done, did you find that video's rise could have been as rapid and successful without the adult industry embracing it so widely?
Oh, no, definitely not. Adult was huge. There are stories told in my book where, guys say that you would go into a video store, a new video store, and it would be literally 3/4 porn. But that's because the studios themselves were first wary of video. They didn't like the idea of videotapes being made of their movies. They wanted to hold on to them. They thought people could only see them in theaters or maybe, be recast on television. So the porn industry was huge on opening up the doors, just as much as detailed in the book, the independent film movement was in a similar way, because there were these scrappy independent distributors and filmmakers who said, hey, here's a place where people want to see movies. Let's get our movies up on those shelves. And so they started sharing the shelves with all those porno films that Kevin Smith loves and details so well.
It's funny because stores obviously were able to sort of build their business around having a significant portion of adult titles. But there was one store that I remember where, before they folded, one of the last things that they carried heavily was adult. And they had some, but in the end they realized, well, the only way for us to survive is to have something that still has kind of a higher rental price to it and something that doesn't cost as much. But they ended up taking, I think, maybe 30%, 40% of the store was actually all adults, and I was shocked when they increased it that much. But they did that for a while, and then eventually they just decided to fold. And I think one of the brothers that ran the company ultimately decided to go into funerals because he found that to be more successful.
That's awesome. Yeah, Blockbuster didn't carry porn. I think, did they carry NC-17? I can't remember if they carried NC-17.
I think they actually avoided it.
They didn't do X, that's for sure. And so that all the mom and pops, that's what kept the mom and pops alive. People talk about how Blockbuster killed the mom and pops, but in many ways, adults helped keep them, buoy them for many years.
The strategy I know in Canada, because this is coming from one of the store owners that I used to do transfers and conversions for. I remember talking to him. His neighbors were two managers of Blockbuster, regional managers, I think. And he was saying Blockbuster's strategy in Toronto for sure was to look at a location that's doing very well, like a classic mom and pop, move in as close as possible to them, open up and have prices that are far lower than what the mom and pop had. Wait until they're destroyed and then jack up your prices and then be the only alternative. And it was a formula that they perfected and ensured that they would move into all kinds of neighborhoods. But then I think ultimately what happened to Blockbuster in Canada is they had these gigantic, often freshly built stores, and the square footage was enormous. The selection was not as big. And then they started to have problems, obviously, with the rent and the property taxes. So little by little, you started to see some of the Blockbusters close before the real problems started to happen years later.
Yeah, it was a failed economic model. I think wasn't a Blockbuster that was offered to they could have bought Netflix for like nothing. So they clearly were not on the ball economically in many ways.
I've got two final questions, and one deals with the book's final chapter on the closing of Kim's, where you have people that lament the passing of stores. And occasionally when you see news reports on a store that's slated to close at the end of the week or at the end of the month, you have people that come by and they visit and they just want to see how things are. And occasionally you'll actually get an owner or a manager who will be kind of candid with the reporter and will just sort of say, well, why are you here now? I mean, why, you say you miss us, but you weren't coming when we really needed you, which was last year or the year before. And it's as though there was some kind of a disconnect between the two different camps. And in a way, it's kind of the people that are coming after maybe several years of absence who decide to visit by. It's part nostalgia and maybe partly in a peculiar way to pay respects to sort of someone that's dying and on life support just before they actually turn off the switch.
Yeah, it is. I understand the video store owner's complaint, but it's true. People don't want to go to the store. It's like the filmmakers say in my book, that people are lazy now. They want stuff fed to them in their homes. That's the primary reason why the video store, is dead. And there's a new technology, and technology has moved a lot of people on. And I think it's tragic, but it's also reality. And I think there must be a way for film lovers. I've been working trying to push this idea that film lovers should be able to find cultural spaces to get together and talk about film and geek out the way that we all used to do at the video store. Now I say that knowing full well that there are a lot of people who still do that at video stores. But for me, as a New Yorker, I don't have a video store near me. So I think there have to be new places where we're going to have to do that.
Similar to the nostalgia for the rental shops and physical media, do you think that in 10 years there might be another generation who will sort of wax fondly on the discovery, the self-edification, and the guilty pleasures that they experience from downloading, from seeing digital rips from obsolete media, and specialty screenings of sort of cult films on dead media like VHS?
I think it's inevitable. I think technology keeps on rolling ahead, and people keep on getting older, and there's going to be nostalgia for it, whether it's 20 years from now or 40 years from now. I guess it's too hard to say. But I'm really happy that, you and I can talk about this right now, and it's vivid enough in our memories, as well as in the memories of the filmmakers who are in the book, to talk about it, and for us to be able to really point out how these films were influenced by the video store. Because it's yet to be seen how streaming is going to influence filmmakers of the next generation. I'm almost tempted to be, snobbish about it and say they can't be helped, or influenced by streaming, not the way video stores can be. But I think that would be naive, because every generation has new influential cultural influences and points of creativity. So, as much as for people who were, came of age in the 80s and 90s, were influenced by the video store, people are going to find influences now.
The concept of budding filmmakers being influenced by digital downloads and streaming may seem absurd to those weaned on renting tapes and DVDs, but Roston is correct in believing every generation will find a way to devour films and be inspired to create. While I did rent movies from local shops, it wasn't even occasional but very rare. My greatest influence didn't stem from movie rentals because membership fees and rental rates were not particularly cheap in the late 1980s and early 90s. My archive was self-built, taping classic movies aired off Buffalo's PBS station and Ontario's own regional equivalent, TV Ontario, taping recent films from pay TV stations and swapping tapes, many of which were curated for each friend's personal tastes. I had a video guru who would regularly say, "You should see these, you'll find them interesting." And more often than not, he was right. I also had the TV Guide and Pay TV Guide with pen marks for all the flick sites set the timer to record, so I could keep building a personal archive of movies, TV shows, cartoons, shorts, and so on. I also used Leonard Maltin and Leslie Hallowell's guides to weigh the value of watching and taping a particular film in the pre-internet printed resource book era, and my own hunger to find new and neater works. It is more than possible to find parallels between taping and downloading, watching live broadcasts and streaming, and time-shifting and binge-watching. Available media streams have changed, but the consumer's desire to pick and customize those streams hasn't changed beyond going digital. So where does the classic video shop fit in if the bulk of consumers are opting for easy, unhindered access? Nostalgia is a dangerous thing because it implies fondness for something that is absent or long gone. It's also a term used by the media to describe a state of mind and an emotion studios can tap into and sell sections of their back catalogs which would otherwise breed dust. People buy into nostalgia by buying a favorite film because it can deliver the perfect state of escapism where they can relive a moment and reappreciate a work that's hopefully gotten better over time. Filmmakers have nostalgia for those experiences that provided a chance opportunity to build careers, and there is a tangible relationship between objects and places that make one feel good. Some might argue cinematheques are the ideal places for film fans to geek out and share experiences, reinforce positive views, and build relationships, but there are different classes of film fans who select the environments that suit their respective comfort zones. High-end cinematheques tend to celebrate the rare, the classic, the forgotten, and the restored in foodless, drinkless environments that treat movies as films, restricting nostalgia to more polite, reserved expressions of geekdom. Indie cinema survived by including nostalgia for home video by presenting value-added special features to a screening, such as Skype Q&As with the filmmakers, a guest speaker and Q&A, or bonus content like curated short subjects. Or they actually screen a movie only available on VHS in a unique attempt to recreate the family TV room with beanbag chairs and bowls of snacks. It's lo-fi entertainment for niche connoisseurs. Video stores offer the original rental experience, but it's that return trip that makes things less convenient for some, and yet we are willing to sacrifice convenience for access to unique archives of film history, just not so often. What may have seen as an act of desperate preservation, Scarecrow Video becoming a non-profit library, is kind of genius, and a portent of how rental shops may survive in the coming years, going non-profit and offering the classic experience of renting movies, but with a safety net that ensures the collection remains available to anyone. As awful as it is, the real horror scenario isn't a business shuttering its doors, but the sad case of Kim's Video, in which reportedly 30,000 tapes were sold to a Sicilian buyer with the intent of preserving an archive but are apparently languishing. When stores close, their archives are often bought by collectors and fellow shops instead of being junked outright, so to an extent a piece of history is parceled out, albeit to mostly private archives. The most bizarre aspect of the Kim's Video deal is that someone in Europe, where the TV standard is PAL, would spend money on a collection of North American NTSC videotapes which they could never rent to anyone unless a renter has a multi-standard VCR. The whole purchase makes no sense unless the intent was to digitize the tapes and make the films available online in some novel streaming or downloading model. I have a separate review of Tom Roston's book at KQEK.com, and in the coming weeks I'll post an edited podcast of the discussion between Roston and Now Magazine's Norman Wilner at a book signing which occurred at Bay Street Video on May 2nd, 2016. If you like this podcast, please visit KQEK.com's Facebook page and follow our Twitter feed at mondomark_KQEK. All podcasts are available via Libsyn, iTunes, and YouTube. The editorial skills responsible for this podcast are also available for hire. If you require audio editing, mixing, and cleaning up interview recordings prior to publication, please visit mondomark.com for more info and to hear demo reels. Until next time, this is Mark R. Hassan, editor of KQEK.com.